One of the best MMA stories of recent years has been the rise of Alexa Grasso, living up to her early promise to dethrone one of the sport's greatest champions, but many forget the rise only came after a 6-fight run as an underachieving strawweight. Today we look at Grasso's turbulent early years in the UFC, and whether her misfires were due to inexperience or fighting in the wrong weight class. Welcome to the INC, and these are the strawweight struggles of Alexa Grasso. The Alexa Grasso story began in 1993 in Guadalajara, Mexico. Grasso's road to the sport was circumstantial. While studying for a degree in nutrition, the youngster began working part-time as a receptionist for her father's MMA gym, later going on to become one of its first female students. The young Grasso took to the sport immediately, and in December of 2012 made her pro debut at just 19 years old. Wins in her first 4 fights saw Grasso catch the eye of the all-female promotion Invicta, as part of a deal which saw teammate Irene Aldana also join the fold. It didn't take long for Grasso to adapt to her new surroundings, winning her first 3 fights with a level of striking well beyond her years, including a Fight of the Year candidate with Japanese star Mizuki Inoue. Grasso was even linked to a match with strawweight champion Livia Souza, but a series of shoulder injuries forced her out of action for 18 months, and led to her considering leaving the sport to return to college. Grasso returned to action with a dominant win over Jodie Esquivel at Invicta 18, by which point the UFC had taken interest in the youngster. The success of Yair Rodriguez and the Latin American version of The Ultimate Fighter sparked a boom in interest in Mexican MMA, with bosses seeing Grasso as the latest pawn in their expansion south of the border. Grasso formally signed a UFC contract in August of 2016, with company president Dana White describing her as one of the brightest prospects in women's MMA history. Grasso made her company debut that November, taking on Ultimate Fighter veteran Heather Clark at Fight Night Mexico City. Grasso used her hand speed to outclass Clark from the beginning, the veteran fighting most of the match with a damaged retina after a Grasso flurry following a failed takedown. Grasso claimed the unanimous decision in front of a boisterous hometown crowd. While fans clamored for her to be fast-tracked up a dry strawweight division, the UFC, spooked by the failure of Paige VanZant, decided to take a slow approach with the 23-year-old. The approach in question was yet another tough alum. Felice Herrig had been an MMA and kickboxing veteran for over a decade, but was more known for her modeling and media work than her success in the cage. As with Clark, Grasso entered the match as a substantial favorite, and with the bout serving as the co-main to Fight Night Houston, gave the Mexican a chance to showcase her skills on the big stage. Herrig, however, didn't read the script, constantly landing counter-rights on the hard-charging Grasso, who seemed to grow frustrated at her evasive opponent. While Grasso was the busier fighter, it was Herrig who landed the more significant strikes, and even got the better of the grappling exchanges when the fight hit the mat. Herrig cashed in as a 5-1 underdog to claim the biggest win of her career, while the UFC were forced to go back to the drawing board with their new star. The loss, however, hadn't weakened Grasso's pulling power in her homeland, and when the company returned to Mexico later that year, Grasso was given a main card slot against Canadian grappler Ronda Marcos. Grasso relished the chance to get back to winning with hometown support behind her, but her plans were scuppered when her toughest opponent reared its head.
Alexa Grasso, 119.
119 libras.
Grasso had always been known as one of the biggest weight cutters in the strawweight division, having come perilously close to missing the limit for her match with Herrig, and the first questions were raised over how sustainable a contender run at strawweight could be. With flyweight having not yet been introduced, Grasso faced the prospect of continuing her heavy cuts, or making the move to 135, where she'd likely be overwhelmed by larger, grappling-heavy opponents. Grasso's match with Marcos instead proceeded as a 119 catchweight, the striker versus grappler clash seeing several momentum shifts through the 15 minutes. While Grasso claimed a split decision, the manner of her wins, along with her weight issues, soured her in the eyes of the UFC. Just 3 fights into her tenure, it appeared the Mexican was already written off as yesterday's news. Following the Marcos win, Grasso expressed interest in competing at UFC 217 in Madison Square Garden, which had quickly become one of the marquee events of the MMA calendar. The fighter's return, however, instead came 5,000 miles away as she took on unbeaten Tatiana Suarez for the UFC's first event in Chile. Suarez enjoyed much fanfare since joining the UFC 2 years earlier, having been a candidate for the US Olympic wrestling team and winning the 23rd season of The Ultimate Fighter. And with Grasso having shown flaws in her grappling, many critics feared the worst for the young Mexican. Their instincts were vindicated, as Suarez took Grasso down early in the first, and while the fighter showed a surprising amount of resolve, she was eventually forced to succumb to a rear naked choke. At the time of writing, it remains the only stoppage loss of Grasso's career.
The last-ditch effort does not come through for Grasso, and an impressive showing for Tatiana Suarez to stay unbeaten.
The Suarez loss seemingly sealed Grasso's fate, an entertaining brawler and key figure for the Mexican market, but lacking the wrestling and composure to be taken seriously as a title threat. This was evidence in Grasso's next booking, as she was set to face undercard darling Angela Hill at Fight Night Lincoln. A month before the fight, however, Grasso was forced to withdraw after rupturing her LCL in training, and along with further hand injuries led to her being out of action for 13 months. The absence was a blessing in disguise, as Grasso used the break to refine her skill set and take extensive training with a sports psychologist. Speaking years later, Grasso stated she considered the time away from the cage to be the turning point in her career.
Well, I changed my strength and conditioning. I knew a new place that names athletics. They work so professional, not only the muscles, your brain is always training too, and I think that was the key for my last fight. Everything is getting sharper, but I think my strength and conditioning was the key.
There were few bells and whistles when Grasso returned to action, taking on Karolina Kowalkiewicz on the prelims of UFC 238. The bout marked the first time Grasso shared a card with flyweight champion Valentina Shevchenko, a woman Grasso would become synonymous with in the second half of her career. The fight would be Grasso's best performance yet, piecing up her veteran opponent in a fast-paced brawl considered one of the best fights of a stacked PPV. While Karolina rallied late on, Grasso claimed a unanimous decision and the breakout win of her company tenure. Although Grasso answered her critics with her performance, doubts remained over whether her grappling leveled up at the same rate as her striking. Luckily, the UFC knew the perfect opponent to test it. For the third time in 6 fights, Grasso appeared on the main card of a Mexican fight night, this time in a co-main slot against former strawweight champion Carla Esparza. As expected, the fight became a conflict of styles. Grasso pieced Esparza apart in the stand-up, while the former champion actively searched for takedowns, appearing to take the upper hand over the first 2 rounds. Grasso's experience of Mexico's altitude paid dividends in the final round, rocking Esparza early on and forcing the wrestler to shoot for desperate takedowns. It was there where Grasso nearly turned the tables on her opponent.
Oh my word! Man! Here we go! Esparza does not want to tap! My word, that's incredible!
Esparza survived a further onslaught to hold on for the judges' scorecards. While one judge scored the final round 10-8 for Grasso, they were unanimous in scoring the first 2 rounds for Esparza. Grasso suffering a third loss in her past 6, while Esparza was pelted with debris by the Mexican crowd. The rest of the year saw Grasso linked to a match with fellow ex-prospect Paige VanZant, who had been actively campaigning for a match as a means of entering free agency. Such was her attempt to coax the UFC into action. Grasso expressed interest in following VanZant and competing at flyweight. It was a division she'd unwillingly become more acquainted with. While the VanZant rumors eventually came to naught, Grasso was given her biggest showcase yet, a main card match with top contender Claudia Gadelha at UFC 246. The bout served on the undercard of Conor McGregor's long-awaited return to MMA, and with extra eyeballs drawn to the show, a win over the former title challenger could raise Grasso's profile to its highest level yet. Those plans were scuppered the day before the event, when Grasso weighed in 6 pounds above the 115 limit. While Gadelha still pushed for the fight to take place, the weight difference between the two passed the threshold of the Nevada State Athletic Commission, forcing the UFC to remove the bout from the card. It didn't take long for Grasso's faux pas to make an impact. In her first social media post after the miss, Grasso announced she would be competing at flyweight going forward, while publicly apologizing to Gadelha for their fight falling through. It would be an inspired decision. No longer hampered by her weight cut, Grasso began a run that saw her become a breakout star of the flyweight division, amassing a 5-fight winning streak that culminated with her upset title win of Valentina Shevchenko. Grasso retained her title in a controversial rematch with Shevchenko at Noche UFC. setting the stage for their long-awaited trilogy bout later this year. Alexa Grasso's story could have easily been a cautionary one. The UFC's eagerness for a marketable Mexican star placed huge pressure on a fighter not physically or mentally ready for it, and could have easily derailed her career before it truly began. But it's a testimony to the fighter's resolve that she overcame those misfires and lived up to her promise. Whatever Grasso achieves in the next chapter of her career, it's safe to say she'll have a loyal fan base willing to support her through thick and thin. Because trust me, they're dedicated.
Why do you ask to show my feet? This is very weird, but yeah, I'm gonna do it because it's pretty weird. Okay, so here's my feet.
This is the INC. Please like, share, and subscribe. Post your feedback in the comments and subscribe to our Patreon page for exclusive content.